And I'm very pleased to say that at the first of today's panels, we're joined by Nicole Hillier of the Woodland Trust and Kevin Martin of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew. So if I could invite you, starting with yourself, Nicole, to introduce yourself, your role within the organisation and your particular area of knowledge with regard to the subject we're discussing today.
Yes, sure. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nicole Hillier and I'm Policy Advocate for Infrastructure at the Woodland Trust. And so my role encompasses policy for infrastructure such as kind of road and transport and energy projects, but on this instance obviously focusing specifically on national highway schemes and looking at their environmental commitments and trying to influence better decision making for trees and woods.
Excellent. Kevin?
Kevin Martin, Head of the Tree Collections at Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. I'm also a researcher at Lancaster University. My specialism is looking at tree selection under climate change and looking at the urban trees and the effect of climate change on urban trees and their establishment.
Excellent. Well, we're going to talk firstly about biodiversity net gain in general, and then get into more specifics around tree planting. If I start with you, Nicole, to what extent do you believe that biodiversity net gain is at this stage a successful policy, and how should it be improved, particularly, of course, with regard to tree planting?
I think at the moment, so the Trust is supportive of the BNG as policy because I think it's got real potential for gains for nature through, when we're considering big infrastructure projects, there's a lot of opportunity for real good gains for nature. I would say at this point, kind of as BNG is not quite bedded into the system yet, there are some really good examples of where BNG can deliver, but we're still kind of at that teething stage of the policy. So I think with a little bit more time we'll get a bit more of a flavour of how well it is doing. But from some of the evidence we have collected internally and commissioned, we have seen that from a Town and Country Planning Act perspective, so it wouldn't necessarily cover national highway schemes, but from a trees and woods perspective, it does appear to be disincentivising developers from removal of woodland planting due to kind of the requirements to replant and the kind of compensation required. But then on the flip side of that, trees and woods are not necessarily getting planted as part of the kind of compensation packages as part of BNG because of the long establishment times required. So we're seeing less trees and woods being planted as a result of BNG requirements. So it's a bit of a mixed picture, but we're hopeful to see BNG kind of improve and get more credence as we go through.
Yeah, and I mean, are there any specific things you would point to in terms of tree planting that government or anyone else should be considering in terms of improving the situation?
So I think possibly more it's like incentivising the planting of trees and woods, and I suppose on a broader sense there's the way that trees and woods can be incorporated into development more widely. That kind of policy behind pushing for trees and woods to be a bit more embedded, so make the case for woodlands to be kind of more, or trees necessarily in like street trees and things like that, kind of bringing it in a bit more of a, not necessarily needing to plonk like a woodland at the edge of a development sort of thing, but introducing trees into landscapes and kind of soft infrastructure that could then be hit those BNG targets while also contributing to things like healthier streets and kind of bringing nature across a development rather than necessarily just at the edge. So I think kind of encouraging developers to put trees and woods into BNG across a development would be quite an easy way to get trees and woods more embedded in that policy.
Thank you. And Mr. Martin, from your perspective, how successful a policy do you think BNG is currently, and are there any particular improvements that you would advocate beyond what we've just heard with regard to tree planting in particular?
Yeah, so as a policy, it is a good thing, and we're going to see more planting and better green infrastructure. I think where we need to think about adapting is when we think about the species. Okay, so a lot of the research work that we've done, there's been a big emphasis, especially on English natives. Now that's fine as a direction, but when we start looking at local provenance seeds, we know that those trees are going to struggle. So when we look at the data that we have, especially from the research that we've done using models, but also functional trait data, we know a lot of our native trees are going to really struggle under future climate scenarios. They don't have enough plasticity within their system to deal with, like this summer, for instance. We've had the hottest and driest summer. So that's the concern that I have, is we have to be careful on what species composition that we start to plant, but also where the sources of that seed's coming from when we look at commercial nurseries. For a lot of the work that we've done at Kew, we've done lots of plant collecting expedition in recent years based on the modelling data. Now, some of that is looking at what we all perceive as an English native species, but we look at the varied range. So through the modelling data that we have, we know that the predicted climate and growing conditions, especially urban London, is very close to the very extremes of what these trees can grow in. So, for instance, we've started selecting seed from Georgia, the country, and up to the Azerbaijan border, and also in Romania. Now, the reason why is when we look at their climate data and we look at what the predictions are for London, those trees are already growing under those conditions. So genetically they have adapted to have that plasticity. So I think that's where we really need to gather pace, is to then influence the commercial nurseries to make sure we're providing the right stock to enable the planting and the mass planting for big projects under BNG.
And what are the key factors that affect survival rates for newly planted trees?
So it's complex. So it's very site dependent. It depends on your growing conditions. But if we look at most urban environments, for instance, it's water stress. Okay, we only have to look at this summer. We've had very little water and we've had high heat. Now, what we know with plants, especially trees, it's the humidity. So because we've had a lack of rain and high heat, especially in urban environments, we've got a very dry air. This is driving the water demand. So it's the real issue now is, one, making sure we have the appropriate species selected, but also how we deal with the planting. So we need to make sure the soils are as best as what we can make of that area. We understand that. We understand how the future climate is going to sit within that, in that site, to make sure we are selecting trees as best we can. And also we need to start thinking, really, if we're going to push for green infrastructure, is to upskilling the whole workforce. Well, that's where we are really lacking. It's fine for people like myself who are researchers, we have this detailed knowledge, but this not only needs to be used within academia, but it needs to be for practitioners, and we really do need to start thinking about the next generation and how we plant and care for trees, and I think that's where we need to focus on also.
Yeah, absolutely. And just expanding with regard to climate change specifically, what I mean, you've referred to the amount of water that is available, water scarcity. But what are the other climate change aspects that can affect survival rate, if any?
Yeah, so what we're seeing is a multiple. So when we look at this under modelling scenarios, we have to look at multiple variables. So when we look at our soils, for instance, that's very important because the water holding potential of those soils is critical on how that tree will establish. So, for instance, if we got a really free draining soil and it has very little water capacity, holding capacity, those trees will be affected very quickly in drought. So when we look at those trees, they would need more maintenance, they would need a better irrigation management plan, and they would need more soil amendments in order to build up that capacity, moisture holding capacity within that soil volume. So it really is understanding our growing conditions and how we need to adapt, but a lot of this is through adapting our soils, understanding how dry those soils are, because for instance we're planting on a clay soil that will have a higher water holding potential, therefore a species that is vulnerable for drought will be supported for a longer period of time. Now what we have to remember, especially with climate change, what we see this summer and what we saw in 22, if we project that to 2100, these summers are going to become more normal. So instead of it being a 1 in 10 or 1 in 20 year event, they're going to become 1 in 3 or 1 in 5. Now that's a concern because trees deal with stress differently, and if you have a tree that we would call a stress tolerator, it has the mechanisms inside its structure to deal with these long hot periods. Now, what we start to see is when we see a stress avoider, they don't have it. So the false autumn that we're all seeing in the media and explained in the media at the moment, that is due to drought stress. So some trees, they're under so much stress and water stress, they're in their very last survival strategy, and that's to drop their leaves. Now, in an urban environment, if you've got a plant that's dropping leaves, that's not providing an ecosystem service in cooling that urban environment. So that's why we have to be really knowledgeable when we start selecting these plants.
Well, I have to say I have great confidence that we have a knowledgeable person in front of us when it comes to trees. There's no one I'd rather plant me a tree. Barry Gardner.
Absolutely, Chair. I want to take you up on, we're talking about trees dying. Mr. Martin, why couldn't you keep the stone pine alive?
Unfortunately, it didn't die. That collapsed due to tree decay. Yeah, I know. It's a very upsetting day.
My favourite tree in the entire world.
I know. Yeah, unfortunately, Physalis sichuanii was the decay organism. It caused cubical brown rot, and then structurally it couldn't hold itself anymore.
There's an answer.
But you are taking the seedlings from it. And growing some from...
Yeah, so there's one planted back there now.
Yes,
from seedling. So there's one back there.
Yeah, very good. Look, actually, let me turn to Ms. Elliott, because I wanted to try and find out why it is that the delivery rates for BNG are just so poor. We've heard that developers are failing to deliver on their commitments, and it's really to try and ask you why that's happening. Is it that they're sowing things incorrectly? Is it, as we've heard from Mr. Martin, that these are not the right seeds to be planting in that particular area? How realistic do you think the development plans are in the first place?
So depending on kind of what the level of scale of the development is, so I think there has been some research recently, and Wild Justice commissioned a report into how successful kind of general mitigation and compensation plans from development, and this was for local housing, and I can touch on national highways specifically in a moment, but then they found that kind of out of 40 odd developments, only 53% of those had actually provided the mitigations and compensations for species enhancements that they planned.
47% of the ecological mitigations were missing.
Yes, of which 73% of them were missing woodland edge flood planting. So they kind of are committing to these things, but not necessarily these things are happening in practice. And and I suppose it could be.
I don't want to cut you off, but I just want to understand. Is it because they're not actually doing what they said they were going to do in the first place? Or is it that they tried to do it but they did it unsuccessfully? What's actually going on here? Is it sleight of hand or is it just failure?
It could be a mixture of perhaps a few different areas. I mean, there is probably quite likely that if, depending on who actually plants the mitigation, it might be that whether or not they have the correct expertise to make sure these trees establish. Tree planting can be quite precarious. There's a lot of factors that need to be involved in making sure that trees will actually survive. So things like, if they're left out in the sun too long while they're being translocated from the nursery, or, not watered or maintained correctly afterwards, those things can affect their survival rates. So it depends, I suppose, on a case-by-case basis on how thorough the developer has accounted for and funded the maintenance of these trees once they're first planted, and also the monitoring to make sure that if there are any issues with the planting that's happened, that they are being picked up earlier rather than later. Obviously the longer you leave the trees in a stressed state, the harder it is for them to then recover, and especially with as like with the summer we've had this year, there's been lots of trees that are going to have been drought stressed, and so being left for long periods of time or not being correct on the soils, it depends, as kind of has been previously said, on how suited those trees would have been to the area in the first place. So it could be a bit of a mixture of factors. It's not necessarily, I guess, that they're not planting them. It might be that some of them have failed, or it might be the funding changes, or they've asked for new planning permissions. I suppose it depends on that individual development, but it could be a range of factors. But we are certainly seeing that from kind of evidence that others have commissioned, that there are some lacking mitigations, and they should certainly be looked into why that is, because these are commitments they're making.
What resource, what skills base do the local planning authorities have in order to ensure that all those conditions that you and Mr. Martin have outlined are critical to the establishment, growth, through that first 5-year period when they're vulnerable to maturity? What resources do the planning authorities actually have to get that right?
So it's quite, I think, a well-known issue in the local planning authorities that resourcing is probably a strong factor in this for enforcement and monitoring of these sorts of schemes. So a couple of years ago, DEFRA did some investigation into this, and I think like 1/5 of LPAs do not actually have access to ecological expertise. So even if they are going out and seeing it, it's not necessarily that the local planning authorities have that expertise due to resourcing issues to actually be able to assess whether or not things are going well or not. So it is partly just from them not being able to put somebody forward.
I was with the Chartered Institute for Ecological and Environmental Management last night, and they were saying the figure wasn't just a fifth. Certainly in terms of designated, they can access expertise, but the designated skills base within the organisation is only 1/3. And of course, if you're pulling it in from the outside, it's not the same as actually having that culture in the organisation to understand it and do it organically, if I can use that expression. So how often are BNG commitments simply not delivering? I mean, at the beginning, to the chair, you gave a fairly upbeat, oh, well, you know, it's maybe taking time to bed in, but I'm sure it'll be all right in the end. You don't think you were a wee bit optimistic?
I suppose I'm trying to give the benefit of the doubt. You know, it's a fairly new policy, and from a Town and Country Planning Act point of view, it's only been in play for a year and 4 months, and if planning applications have not got through the system yet, it will be time for for the planting or, you know, the biodiversity enhancements to have actually embedded in, so that the local planning authorities can perhaps see whether or not the impact has been made that there is. So I guess it's trying to give some developers the chance to actually embed these policies and do the net gain, while also making sure that we're keeping an eye on the fact that these are happening, I guess, is perhaps the way I'm approaching it at the moment.
Mr. Martin, anything you'd like to add about the way in which this is being delivered?
Yeah, it's going to be so difficult because we have, especially with developments, we have this culture where we plant trees and we don't think about their establishment. There is always funding to plant trees. There is never shortage to plant trees. Where the shortage comes, but both in finance, but resourcing and staff and knowledge, is in this establishment. And this is something we do need to work on, is this establishment, and trying to steer away from just planting numbers of trees and work towards established trees. Now, when we look at tree establishment especially, we look between 5 and 7 years before a plant is established. Even with a lot of the research that we're doing, we know that these trees that we're now starting to understand will have better ability to adapt to drought. They still need support until they're established, because they need established root systems. So I do think the emphasis needs to be now on establishment of trees.
And look, it's been said that BNG doesn't sufficiently incentivise the restoration or improvement of ancient woodland. It's a transactional process, the BNG, and therefore they favour simple solutions. You know, plant hundreds of saplings. Is that a fundamental flaw in BNG right at the beginning?
So the way that with how BNG works, in that ancient woodlands and irreplaceable habitats are accounted for outside of the metrics. So in theory, they shouldn't be included within the calculations, as they're irreplaceable habitats, so you can't account for them. So I suppose when the policy first became something the government was looking into, we did ponder how we were going to approach ancient woodlands and irreplaceable habitats to make sure that they are not insufficiently accounted for in this process. So I think the DEFRA metric does account for ancient woodland by keeping it separately, but I think it's and it has been deterrent.
It doesn't facilitate natural woodland regeneration, does it?
No. So what was that? Sorry, can I just? It
doesn't facilitate natural woodland regeneration.
So part of it, for if there's any ancient woodland on site for a development, if there is kind of compensatory measures, I think you can. I'd have to double check on the specifics of the legislation, but I think you can provide enhancements for ancient woodland as part of your BNG. As long as you're not directly affecting the ancient woodland, you can provide enhancements to an ancient woodland to make sure to count toward your BNG metric. So it can be, I guess it depends on whether a developer is choosing to have that option as opposed to just planting more trees rather than tackling
I think
the
my
woodland.
point was that because of the transactional nature of it, they're less likely to go for that option.
Possibly, yes.
Mr. Martin?
I don't have any more to add to this. A couple of comments.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Martin, we've kind of already covered this, but I just wanted to explore it a little bit more thoroughly. Do you think the current policies, or what policies could be encouraged to make sure that the right tree is planted in the right place, rather than just the largest amount of trees or whips, for example, and making sure that climate resilience is also involved in that policy?
Yeah, I think it can't be one rule fits all. I think we do need to definitely look at, when we're looking at policy especially, we have a specific one for the urban environment, because how we deal with the urban environment is going to be completely different to if we're creating new woodlands. And when we think about, especially when plans come in with planting plans for urban developments, we really have to start to think about what trees are being selected and placed where. So if we're looking at, for instance, biodiversity net gain, if we don't think about our species selection for urban environments, people could be planting large, broad-spreading trees next to houses. Now, at some point in that tree's life, it's going to get in conflict with that property or building or that infrastructure, and we really do need to start to think about that. And when we think about climate, I just think there needs to be more emphasis on understanding the site conditions. And what we tend to see currently is we will see the same species composition or same species mix planted everywhere, and it needs to be really specific to that site. And I think if we can try and guide that by policy, would be a big breakthrough on how we deal, especially with green infrastructure moving forward.
Do you think we need to kind of educate not only people but also the public about the fact that the trees that they might be used to seeing might be replaced, or like new trees that might come into an area might be different, and the reasons why, so that people can understand that a bit better?
Yes, so from the work that I do, that is probably one of the biggest tasks we have. So we need a cultural change. I talk about this a lot when I give public engagement talks at Kew. You know, we've got used to having a certain type of plant within our gardens and our spaces. Now, if we think about the plants that we see and we all know and love, a lot of those plants are from the early Victorian era, from those plant collectors. Now, they collected and selected plants for horticultural beauty and wonder. Now, what we're seeing as we're getting warmer and we're going through these drought periods, those plants, because they put so much energy into growth and having showy flowers, they don't have any hydraulic capacity to deal with drought. So we really do need to try and work on a public engagement piece on this shift to understand we're going to have to culturally start shifting our mindsets. So, like for instance, I know lots of local authority tree officers, they're always under pressure to plant flowering cherries. Now, flowering cherries, when it comes to drought tolerance, are probably one of the worst. So we need to start, one, looking at better suited species of flowering cherry, but two, we need to engage with the public to explain why we need to see this shift, especially in our urban environments, especially in the southeast of the UK.
That's really helpful. And just quickly, do you think that nurseries are prepared for the needs of the climate we're bringing in terms of what they're currently cultivating?
So this is the next big step. So if we look at our current nursery stock, they don't often hold enough stock of some of the better suited species. Also, I've done a large amount of research in this area trying to understand how we can move forward. Now, when I ask the nurseries if they know the provenance of their plants, so the original where that seed come from, they can't tell you. Because a lot of the plants that we have within the commercial nursery sector are clones. So they're taken from cuttings and they're passed around the commercial. So we have a very small, diverse genetic material of plants. So what we need to start to look at is encouraging the commercial nurseries to start creating partnerships to get seed from better suited environments, especially in our urban environments, so from these drier ecosystems. So places like Georgia, Azerbaijan and Iran, Romania, for instance. They're the ones we should be trying to create partnerships to get that seed into the nurseries to produce those trees.
I mean, I can talk to you about this all day, but I'll bring Mr. Hillier in and just ask, is there enough monitoring in the years following development to ensure planting is successful and remedied? And I think that's the key thing for me, like, should there be more focus on remedying if not?
Yeah, so definitely. So I have done a bit of an analysis of, in terms of for national highways in particular, for the committee, on their kind of how well it's been going after the schemes have been operational. So I did have a look into about 20 of their post-operational project evaluations to get a bit of an understanding of how well schemes are being monitored and how good maintenance is after the process of development has happened. And so the results were a bit bleak, if I have to be honest. Only one project really probably delivered good monitoring post-construction in our kind of professional opinion, and 3 provided a consistent regime. And so what we would really recommend in these instances with these schemes, if they're being left for 5 years afterwards, that perhaps National Highways maybe needs to look at whether their contractors are suitably monitoring the schemes beforehand, making sure that things are happening, rectifying any issues, and also maintaining these trees in good order before getting to the point where National Highways are then doing kind of their POPs, as they're referred to, which then highlight that there's issues. And then we have situations like the A14, where obviously all the trees, like I think 3/4 of the trees did die. So we would recommend that there are kind of really clear steps and framework that developers, such as National Highways in this instance, but other developers could follow, which actually sets out that there are at what point they need to provide monitoring data, at what point they need to have evidence that they have been maintaining the trees and maintaining the habitats to make sure that they are actually delivering what has been expected, so that they are showing value for money, and also are delivering what there's been promised as part of their commitments in terms of development consent or at local planning level.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Cameron Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. So I've had the pleasure of joining some dedicated parishioners and councillors in planting community orchards over the last couple of years, and they're coming along really nicely. But on the other hand, you have some large-scale, high-profile examples of failed planting schemes, such as on the A14 between Cambridge and Huntingdon. What do you suppose might explain the difference between those schemes carried out by dedicated caretakers of their communities and those carried out by contractors? And would you suggest that preparation work might play a role?
So I guess it comes back to a point I made earlier that it depends on what the level of expertise is on those that are planting the trees. So if contractors have that ecological knowledge and that arboricultural knowledge to be able to plant trees and make sure they do thrive, again, if they are not maintaining or monitoring them in a quick in kind of reasonable amount of time, they may not be picking up on those issues. And I guess from a local community perspective, they possibly will see them more, with obviously being local to the area, so there is possibly an element that, you know, they're being monitored by the local community as well. But yeah, I think really what is key here is making sure that monitoring and maintenance schemes are effective, and they're a bit they're more robust and a bit more stand up a bit more to scrutiny from that perspective. As it stands, it doesn't seem like trees are getting quite as much attention perhaps as they could do. And also that's not even considering the impacts of climate change and how that will make them even more stressed, as Martin was mentioning beforehand. So, yeah.
Kevin?
Yeah, so it is down to multiple factors. So we have to really understand what the site conditions were, but also what species were selected. So, for instance, if they're on a roadside, they're going to be in full sun. So those trees, you're going to be looking at your real stress tolerators, your trees that can really deal with drought. And then it's really, again, it's down to the skill set of the contractors dealing with the establishment. Now, from what I read, it's a failed establishment, so the watering probably wasn't where it needed to be. And that combined with poor species selection is why the mortality rate is so high in this instance. And I think that's where we need to really start to build our knowledge and getting the right expertise in these areas to make sure that these planting plans do become established.
So if we go again to Ms Hillier and then to Kevin, for future large-scale developments such as highways, how can planning officers and ministers ensure that mitigation and biodiversity net gain plans are actually feasible?
So as I've mentioned previously, I would suggest having quite a clear framework so that the data will then be visible and transparent for ministers to be able to assess national highways against. So if there are clear milestones and goals when this sort of information needs to be provided by, that will incentivise national highways to keep tabs on any contractors they have provided this information to, and give them the opportunity to feed back and show that monitoring is in place, that they are establishing at a rate that would be expected, that any other biological enhancements such as, I think, for example, where things were not included, was like there was an otter bridge that wasn't included and things like that, that they are actually ticking off and showing that these enhancements are in place, and that they can then demonstrate that the value for money to the public purse has been delivered there.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it would be good if they could invest in an expert to make sure the species selection's right for that site. I think that would be a really big help, and also what the establishment plan is. So for tree establishment, you'd be looking for irrigating, checking the tubes, making sure, because sometimes the tubes can overheat the plant, make sure the soil conditions are right and the soil's not compacted. So it's making sure that there's essentially a tick system where they can be monitored against over a 7 to 10 year period, that these maintenance checks have been proved to be carried out, and what the losses are, but what the establishment rates are. Because you will always lose some young trees, I do even at Kew, but it shouldn't be as vast as that. So there should be a very clear recording process on what they lose and what the maintenance plan is, and then having oversight by an expert if those plans need to be adjusted to increase establishment rates.
Well, thank you very much for that. I'm afraid I'm going to have to bring this session temporarily to a close. Those watching our proceedings might not be aware that the division bells have just gone, so members will have to leave now and vote briefly, and will then return. Well, welcome back everyone to this important session. We were just hearing from Nicole Hillier and Kevin Martin before we broke for the division. We've heard the questions of Cameron Thomas and now over to Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Martin, you mentioned earlier on in terms of, in particular to London and issues of water stress factors and so on, climate change. More generally, in regards to urban areas, are there particular challenges in terms of around urban areas or big infrastructure, road building projects and so on?
We're going to see, because we're going to see a lot more pressure on the plants and trees, especially around big infrastructure, because you've got to remember you'll plant alongside roads. Now, we have to realise what happens when they're with the road surface. So it absorbs heat all day, radiates at night. Therefore, as a microclimate, it pushes those temperatures up. And the stresses for plants is exaggerated. So we have to also understand that, and that's also if the soil's compacted, or if we start to see large areas of grass there. So this summer, when the grass goes brown, now when that grass goes brown, that increases our soil temperatures really fast, because what will happen is that soil becomes baked. It then takes on the similar properties as concrete. It will absorb heat and radiate at night. So that's why it's really critical that we understand this when we're looking at the trees we select, to make sure those trees that we are selecting can deal with these extra stresses.
And you mentioned earlier about choosing particular species and so on. But what about aftercare, in terms of once they're planted, what's required in terms of planting these sorts of places?
What I spoke about earlier is that establishment stage. So for those first 5 to 7 years, is making sure they are watered regularly, and that's just so they can establish their root systems. Once those root systems are established, that plant can then start to look after itself. Especially we can select better suited species, or not just species but plants which are selected from better suited environments. So the seed sources come from these semi-arid ecosystems. Once they're established, they will have the ability to deal with these stresses through their functional traits. So that's what's really critical. And it's a combination now that we understand how we select species for a site, tree selection for a site, but also the establishment. And once they're established, hopefully you should then start to see better returns.
And you said just before the break there, with regard to there's always planting trees, there's always some in terms of failures, and that's always the case. If you're planting in the right conditions, what's the normal failure rate?
I would expect to see no more than 20% realistically. If you're doing a really good establishment, I wouldn't expect to see more.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, to me, I think you raised some really important points here around the skills that are needed to ensure the success of the biodiversity net gain policy. This is a policy, we're talking particularly about the Highways Agency, a major organisation, but an organisation primary function is around roads. It's also a policy that's responded to by house builders, major house builders, but also very small house builders, maybe just building a few units. And this is adding a huge new area of responsibility that previously they wouldn't have had. And I wonder if that's something that enough thought has been given to. I mean, in terms of the skills required to ensure the success of these sort of developments, do you think government's given enough thought to ensuring that organisations might be entirely well-meaning don't see failures of these schemes which undermine public confidence in biodiversity net gain, and also mean we don't actually get the nature development that we need? So, I mean, Mr. Martin, do you think that as part of our recommendations we should be saying something more when it comes to biodiversity net gain around ensuring those skills are in place, even amongst sort of relatively small organisations who have these responsibilities?
Yeah, that is probably one of our biggest problems. If we look at horticulture as an industry, we're getting very little uptake now, and we are getting to a critical point where we have got a big skills gap, and that's a real concern. We're seeing a lot less young people go into this career, and it's also the support for higher education. From the difference from when I trained in early in 2000 to what we see now in colleges is completely different. The funding's not there, and the colleges are really struggling to support the learning of young people to move into this industry, but also we need to try to influence the next generation, and I think that's where we really do need to gather pace, and especially for things like biodiversity net gain, but also if we look at trying to use green infrastructure, especially to deal with urban heat islands and use nature-based solutions, this is a sector that we really do need some help in building those skills.
And Nicole Hillier, from your perspective, if you were sort of advising developers, government agencies or anyone else, what sort of advice would you give them as to how they make sure that they aren't going to spend a lot of money doing something that ultimately fails?
So I think it's really considering the trees that they're planting as critical infrastructure as part of the road scheme themselves. So when they're developing schemes, really embedding the use of trees as a nature-based solution from a really early stage of the process, because trees can provide a lot of benefits from the to the actual road scheme itself by reducing or holding water off the side of the road and things like that. So they can really be of value if they are established well, so that they can actually bring benefits to kind of the road maintenance itself. Things like kind of reducing the moisture that's on the road by like taking that moisture up, or potentially reducing aquaplaning on that if that's kind of that water's able to run off. And that also produces the ability to form a natural highway along the side that could also contribute to the wider commitments around biodiversity. So it's really seeing trees as part of not necessarily something that has to be kind of planted alongside for mitigation purposes, but really seeing the value of them that they bring to the highways. They provide screening or noise abatement. There's a lot of benefits that having well established and kind of well cared for trees that could then provide returns from kind of ecosystem services that trees do generally provide. So I'd really kind of embed that thought that bringing trees into the development in an early stage can really benefit National Highways and other developers by providing some services for free, which I'm sure everybody would love to do.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole Hillier, Kevin Martin, for your evidence today. Very grateful, and we'll bring this first panel to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
I look forward to our visit to Kew. So looking forward to our visit to Kew.
Yeah, that would do.
So would you mind listening that? Thank you.
Yeah, that's me. Sorry, love.
Welcome, both of you. Okay, are you guys ready? Yep. All set. Lovely. Well, I'll count down from 5 again, and we will recommence. 5, 4, 3, 2. Order. Well, the second panel of today's event is with us now. I'm very pleased to have Joe Bradley of Stormwater Shepherds and Catherine Moncrief from the Chartered Institute of Environmental and Water Management. Joe, if I could start with you, can I ask you just to introduce yourself, your organisation, and what it is particularly you do that will be of relevance to this particular one-off inquiry?
Yeah, my name's Jo Bradley. I work for a small charity called Stormwater Shepherds. I was with the Environment Agency for 28 years before that. My focus at the moment and for the last few years has been pollution from highway runoff, and my entire career has been built on pollution control of various sorts and various guises.
Excellent. And yourself, Catherine?
Good afternoon. So my name's Catherine Moncrief. I work for the Chartered Institution of Water and Environmental Management. I'm Head of Policy and Engagement, so I work to connect practice and policy and improve decision making on all aspects of water and environmental management.
Excellent. Thank you all. We'll start this session with my colleague Chris Hinchcliffe.
Thank you, Chair. I thought, Ms Bradley and Ms Moncrief, I'd just begin by highlighting a news story that caught my attention recently. I'm sure you may well be aware of recent reports in the press of chronic contamination of chalk streams by microplastics. Thousands of tonnes of these pollutants are entering our surface waters from tyre wear every year, and now we know they're in what should be one of our most pristine habitats. And in my constituency of North East Hertfordshire, residents are desperate to see the River Rib, the River Ivel, the River Bean restored to what should be their natural glory. When our predecessor committee looked at pollution in road runoff during its inquiry on water quality in rivers, the government and National Highways accepted that more action was needed. That was in 2022. What is your assessment of the action since then? Do you think there have been improvements, and could you detail where those improvements have been, what they might still be lacking?
Sure. Shall I start?
Yeah.
So I would say since the previous report that there has been some action, and I can go into what that's been a little bit. But broadly, this issue of highway pollution is still really flying under the radar. It hasn't had the media and political attention that, for example, sewage pollution and other forms of pollution have had. So it's still the sort of poorer cousin. We don't feel it's had the political attention. It's certainly not got the level of funding committed to it that, for example, sewage pollution has. And the issues are still very much there and increasing. We've had greater evidence about the issues, as you mentioned, associated with tyre abrasion, brake abrasion, and the percentage of microplastics in our oceans and waterways that are derived from tyre wear. I think the science says it's about 45%. With the onset of EV, those electric vehicles, that's not getting any better, that type of pollution. They're heavier, so the abrasion is greater. With more braking and heavier vehicles, you've got that more particles ending up in our waterways. So, and also with climate change and drier spells like we've seen this summer, followed by heavy rainfall, means you get these large flushes of pollution into waterways from roads. So the issue isn't going away, it's getting worse. I am aware that National Highways have made some progress tackling these issues, and I'm sure you'll be asking them questions in the next session, but I'm aware that they're putting a greater proportion of their environmental budget on the issue of water quality, and they've set out targets, and they've also been working with SIWEM and other stakeholders to look at a rapid prioritisation tool to look at how other highway outfalls can be identified, other high-risk outfalls can be identified.
Thank you, Ms Bradley.
Yes, thank you, Kat. It's interesting that the sewage pollution has got all the press coverage and everybody wants to talk about sewage. There are, I think, between 15,000 and 18,000 storm sewer overflows which have been allowed to spend, the water companies have been allowed or encouraged to spend £56 billion improving the discharge from those over between now and 2050. There are 25,000 outfalls from the strategic road network to watercourses or to ground, and the investment in those is in the millions. And I would argue that the pollution is as bad or if not worse because it's toxic pollution and the discharges are causing harm to the environment, and one wonders why one of those topics has got £56 billion and the other one has got meagre millions by comparison.
For the sake of the record of the committee and for any of our viewers, could you perhaps provide a bit of detail for the comparison of the impact of sewage pollution as compared to pollution from our roads and what that's doing to our waterways?
Well, it's difficult to know because nobody's measuring harm, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So sewage pollution, particularly from a rural community, a village or so, is largely organic. So it's organic pollution, it's the things that we flush down the toilet and come out of our kitchen sinks. Highway runoff contains microplastics highway particles, as Kat mentioned, but also hydrocarbons and toxic metals. And together they create a toxic cocktail that goes into the water environment. And together those pollutants are known to exert toxic effects. They are mutagenic, they create deformities in the creatures that live in the water, they cause abortions, they cause birth defects, they prevent copulation in some species, they cause deformities in fish eyes. They also have a narcotic effect, so the creatures that live in the river are their behaviour is changed, so they're a bit spaced out and they don't run away from their predators as they should, and they don't chase their prey as they should. And so the behaviour of creatures in the water environment is massively affected by highway runoff. It's a nasty, insidious, toxic effect. In fact, my work would be easier if it just killed everything, because we would have fixed this 30 years ago. But because it has this sublethal effect on every part of the lives of those creatures, it affects their heart function, their liver function, their endocrine function. It has this effect of suppressing the population, preventing the creatures from thriving, reducing reproduction. So it's that harm that's caused by highway runoff that we need to take seriously. Sadly, nobody's really measuring harm. So the monitors that the water companies have been told to introduce to measure storm overflows measures how often they go off and how long they go off for. It doesn't actually measure what harm that is having on the water environment. So there's a little river, well, quite a big river near my house called the River Darwen, and there's a storm overflow into the River Darwen, which the United Utilities have on their list, and they will spend £1.5 million fixing that so that it reduces the number of discharges. But just a mile upstream, the M6 crosses the same river, and all the runoff from the M6 comes into that river with no treatment at all, causing toxic harm and toxic pollution. There's no investment there. There's no plan to invest in that outfall. There's no monitoring of that outfall. There's no measure of the impact of that outfall, and so nothing's happening. And it makes no sense from an environment protection point of view to not have a full and comprehensive understanding of what's causing harm in our water environment, but simply to spend money on one source of pollution is madness.
And my final set of questions then, picking up specifically what you've just said then, Ms Bradley, I mean, you've talked about no one's measuring this properly. As a layperson, is that perhaps because it's a more diffuse problem and harder to track in a way that you can just go to a sewage outflow, or perhaps I'm missing something, and who you would recommend should be doing that, as that we can recommend as this committee should be doing that monitoring. Ms Moncrief, whether you've got any sort of essential recommendations that you think we should be making so that this pollution doesn't continue to fly under the radar.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Just to build on what I said before. So these outfalls are pipes. I could take you to them and we could stand and poke them. They're not diffuse. It's not diffuse pollution like landfill pollution that sneaks into the river underground. These are big pipes. There's a photograph, I think, in your pack of one of them. So yes, you could regulate and monitor them. The Environment Agency have a statutory responsibility embedded in the legislation that says for all known discharges of priority hazardous substances, they have a duty to monitor them, control them, and ultimately eliminate them. They know that these discharges contain priority hazardous substances. I've told them, other people have told them, research has been telling them so for 30 years, and yet they do not monitor any highway outfalls in England, and they have no monitoring points on their monitoring programme that are specifically located to measure pollution from highway runoff. And there's a little outfall, well, a biggish outfall into a little tiny stream in the woods in Chorley in Lancashire, and the runoff from the M6 comes out of a pipe into a little stream called Sidbrook. It should be a little babbling watercourse going through the woods with, sparkling sunshine and hundreds of insects. It's not, it's just a black swamp. And when we last swept it, we found water fleas and bloodworms and nothing else. And that discharge that's a strict liability criminal offence, no question, because it's breaching the environmental quality standards. The Environment Agency don't monitor it. When I've complained to them, they've done nothing. But their monitoring point is 3 miles downstream. So they look at their monitoring data and they go, we see no signature pollutants from highway runoff, so we have no problem. And so their river basin plan for that catchment doesn't include that outfall. It's not on their radar, they don't measure it, they're not interested in measuring it, and yet every time it rains, 150 times a year in Chorley, it causes gross toxic pollution of that little tiny stream, which is a criminal offence, but there's no measuring. Nobody knows, except me. A couple of dog walkers.
So, I mean, I think Joe's made the point very clearly there that there isn't monitoring that is done by the Environment Agency, specifically on highways outfalls, and there absolutely should be, because it is one of the biggest, most toxic causes of pollution in this country, and we know that. So there does need to be monitoring. At the moment, we don't even know the exact level of harm, as Joe says. We've got the Environment Agency Water Framework Directive monitoring points, but they're very sparse. They might be downstream, so then, and they may not be measuring the right substances, so they're not picking up on this pollution. That's the first step to solving this problem, I think.
Okay, thank you very much.
Anna Gelder.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you both of you for painting such a clear picture about the problem that we're here to talk about. The National Highways Water Quality Plan focuses on sites identified as most high risk for pollution. What you've said already leads me to think that you're not satisfied, but I don't want to put words in your mouth. So are you satisfied that they're able to identify the right sites for priority mitigation, or if not, what should they be doing instead?
I'm rarely satisfied, sadly. There are 25,000 highway outfalls and soakways on the strategic road network, and their water quality plan, I think, identifies 126 that they're intending to mitigate before 2030. I don't suppose you're surprised that I'm not satisfied with that, bearing in mind I think all 25,000 are causing toxic pollution every time it rains. There's a massive gap between what the National Highways Water Quality Plan says and what the water chemistry says. I've only taken 25 samples, but every one of them has failed the environmental quality standards for hydrocarbons. So how can you have a risk assessment tool that says 24,900 and whatever of them are fine, and every time I take a sample, and indeed every time National Highways have taken historic samples, they've failed the standard? There's a gaping chasm between those two things, and I don't know how we bring that together. I recognise we've not got a bottomless pit of money to fix all the outfalls. But my other concern with the water quality plan is that if you read the plan, it tells you which outfalls they're planning to remediate over the next so many years in steps. In their annual return for 2024, one of those outfalls was identified as the discharge off the M6 junctions 21A to 26, which was a smart motorway project. So they were doing a smart motorway project. I think it was £260 million. And on that stretch of motorway, they said, some of these outfalls, there are 14 outfalls, we're going to introduce some remediation on 6 of them. So one of them, Network 5, discharges into Spittlebrook, and their risk assessment tool said this is a risk, we have a risk of pollution, their risk assessment tool said we must remove 91% of the suspended solids in the runoff. And so the designers selected a device called the Vortex Grit Separator, marvellous, British manufacturer, lovely thing, but it only, with the best will in the world and a favourable wind, it only removes about 40% of the suspended solids. So immediately you've got a gap between what their risk assessment said and what they're delivering. Then the designers said, well, we need one that treats 350 litres per second, but they bought one that treats 160 litres per second. So there's a gap between what they projected they needed and what they purchased. But actually, it's a 17-hectare catchment of motorway coming to that one pipe. So actually, they should have been treating 1,300 litres per second, but their design guidance has a gap in it. So the device they bought wasn't the right device anyway. It was 8 times smaller than it should have been. And it also has a capacity to capture 3 cubic metres of sediment, whereas that catchment will produce 17, roughly, using National Highways' own data, 17 cubic metres of sediment a year. So it would need emptying every 8 weeks. So where the water quality plan says we will remediate 125 outfalls by 2030, and we've done the M6 junction 21 to 26, and we've cleaned up 1.86 miles of river, that's not the case. So because the device is too small, it's the wrong device and it won't be emptied often enough. So my concern is not only that the water quality plan is not ambitious enough, my other concern is when they say they've ticked a box at an outfall and said, we've done this one, tick, they haven't.
So would you recommend that they perhaps revisit their designed guidance?
Absolutely. I've told them some gaps and I've said fix that please. So that's a recommendation.
And Ms Moncrief, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think as Joe alluded to, there are some shortcomings with the risk assessment tool that's being used to identify the high risk outfalls and set those targets in the water quality plan. And those shortcomings include just the fact that it was built a long time ago and science has moved on and some of the pollutants have changed. We've got new emerging pollutants. It also depends on good data in, and we don't necessarily always have good data. Just basic things like understanding where the outfall goes to. Does it go to a drain or a sewer, and exactly which water body, where does it emerge? And then, as discussed already, we don't have the baseline data on water quality into the receiving water body either. So it's a little bit a case of rubbish in, rubbish out slightly is my concern with that tool, as well as the fact that it was built a long time ago. So I think it needs a review.
Really helpful, and we are due to be we've recently started the inquiry about PFAS forever chemicals, and in my constituency in South East Cornwall, the A38 had some work done, and we were looking at road runoff, and I know that this is a concern to constituents, and so it's really good that the committee is looking at this topic. You've outlined a bit about percentages and other really important bits, but to the extent that you would speak about PFAS chemicals particularly, do you have anything that you want to tell the committee on that front?
I don't have anything specifically on PFAS in relation to highways runoff.
Ms Bradley?
The research I've looked at suggests that actually highway runoff isn't a major source of PFAS pollution. And actually, I don't worry about it too much, because if we deliver treatment schemes that treat the pollutants that we are conscious of, the metals, the hydrocarbons and the suspended solids, we can very easily augment them in the future with treatment systems that will deal with PFAS if we find that it's a problem.
Very much. Julia Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. Both of you mentioned in your evidence, you kept saying in this country there's a gap in monitoring. Do either of you have examples from overseas, a country where this is monitored and mitigated?
I don't, I'm afraid.
I've spoken to a few colleagues around the world about highway runoff, and frankly, I don't think anybody's very good at this. There are parts of America that are better than us. And in Germany, they do have some legislation about the treatment of highway runoff of certain roads going to certain receptors. I spoke to a gentleman in Vietnam who said they just don't do anything at all. So there are parts of the world where they are behind us and other parts of the world where they are ahead of us. But the knowledge of harm in the water environment globally is still lacking, and so fixing the problem is really difficult because we don't have enough information on the extent of the problem.
So are you saying that's also the case in the research community? It's not as if there's a research network across countries where they're talking and raising these questions?
There's a little work going on in Sweden where they are talking about this and working together. A lady from Middlesex University is heavily involved in that. There are thousands of global papers researching pollutants in highway runoff. What's missing is effective treatment, research into effective treatment.
Mm-hmm. Would you mind just sending this committee the link to the person at Middlesex Uni, just
Absolutely.
so that we can follow up that Sweden link to help us in our research?
Yeah.
Okay, my real question was, you're aware that our predecessor committee produced a report and we recommended that the Environment Agency should require discharge permits for all outfalls on roads with heavy traffic. But the then government disagreed, calling it a regulatory and resource burden which was not justified. What is your view on that recommendation and response?
I think it is justified given the level of harm that highways pollution causes. We know that it's one of the major 3 sources of pollution. The fact that there's not even any monitoring going on within the Environment Agency on this issue is astounding, given that it's known to cause or thought to cause 18% of failures against water quality. So I think it's absolutely justified.
I agree. I understand that it would be very expensive. The money would have to come from the public purse. So I think the Environment Agency should investigate ways to streamline it. So something like general binding rules or standard permits. that in their response to the committee last time, I think the Environment Agency said that they used a collaborative and partnership approach to managing this problem, but they've been doing that for 15 years and we haven't moved forward at all. So I think we must end that voluntary approach and have a more regulatory approach.
And do you think that regulatory and resource burden explains why more action has been taken against sewage, which the cost burden falls to the private water companies, than action has been taken on roads where the burden falls for government departments?
I'm not sure that's a question we can answer. I perhaps put that back to the committee. I don't know. To me, it's water pollution. Whoever, ultimately, we'll all pay for it anyway, won't we? Whether it's through our water bills or through our road tax, somebody has to pay to reduce this water pollution. There are strategies that I think we described perhaps last time, and certainly in the report that Siwam and ourselves wrote, where you could introduce a stormwater utility levy, as they have in Germany, where every household pays a levy associated with the impermeable surface in their home, and that goes towards managing stormwater. Parts of America have that too. You could increase road tax and create a ring-fenced fund for dealing with this. Perhaps that wouldn't be particularly popular. But then you could levy on tyres or brake pads or car purchase. This is a massive problem and somebody has to pay to fix it.
We know there are wider changes coming to the regulation of the water sector through the Cunliffe Review. Do you see this as an opportunity to improve the management of road pollution?
I would really hope so. I think there are some good points made in the Cunliffe Review about the need to focus on other forms of pollution and the fact that the water industry carries sort of the heaviest burden, if you like, in terms of addressing water quality issues. So I think that point is really valid. But the Cunliffe Review was very focused on the water industry. It's proposing a regulator, a super regulator, which will be mainly focused on the water sector. And so my concern is that highway runoff will slip further under the radar because the focus is still on the water sector. Another point made in the Cunliffe Review that was really welcome was the fact that we need to focus more on source control, and I think that's really, really important for this form of pollution. There's a lot that can be done in this space. So, for example, in terms of tyre wear and those microplastic particles that are coming from tyres, there are the Euro 7 emission standards that have been introduced into Europe this summer. They're going to be enforced, I think it's in 2028. We should really follow suit. Europe's taking the lead here. We absolutely need to follow suit, but it's not clear at the moment whether the government's going to do that.
So a recommendation around aligning those standards with the EU?
Absolutely. And then I think the other thing is managing rainwater where it falls. So before the water gets onto the roads and starts picking up pollution, let's manage rainfall where it falls, spongify, or make our urban areas, our rural areas spongy, so that when it rains that water is absorbed, filtered and released slowly and stop it getting onto the roads and causing problems, water pollution but also flooding as well.
Thank you. And Jo Bradley, did you have any thoughts about the opportunity in the Cunliffe Review?
Yes, I think if we miss it, we'll be. I should be blaming myself forever, because we'll lose another 10 years if we miss this opportunity to get highway runoff pollution included in the white paper that will be prepared in response to the review. So yeah, we would really like to see recognition of this pollution. And Kat just mentioned spongifying cities. It's important to remember that we're here to talk about national highways today, but other roads, rural roads, the cul-de-sac outside my house, they can drain into nature-based solutions, so they can go into swales and tree pits and rain gardens. The pollution load is low enough that nature-based solutions can cope with road runoff from those types of roads. And so that links in really nicely with some of the recommendations of the Cunliffe Review for sustainable drainage systems.
Did you respond to the Cunliffe Review?
I did, yes.
Keep responding.
Slightly grumpily.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I mean, you reflected there that about the big difference between how much of an issue water company and sewage pollution is in comparison to road runoff. And clearly one of the differences is that when it comes to water companies, we have a private body, private companies, profit-making organisations that the government can go after and say, right, you've got to sort this out. Here we've got something that actually is government's responsibility, and the paying for it will be coming out of their coffers. Do you think that that is a reason why government have been much more interested in sewage pollution than in road runoff? And if not, I mean, have you got any suggestions as to why you think one of these is so much more of an issue politically and in the news cycle than the other is?
Oh, my instinct is it's mostly been driven by social media, public noise, press coverage, Fergal Sharkey being interviewed on the radio all the time and talking about sewage, and the focus on water companies, the capitalist nature of water companies, and firing people up to sort of this sort of fury of anger about water companies and how they function. It's quite difficult to get that same attention for highway runoff. I've spoken. It's interesting because the river swimmers drove that interest in sewage pollution. You know, lots of people went river swimming during COVID and said, this is ridiculous, we're swimming through raw sewage. And I was hopping up and down saying, you're also swimming through highway runoff, which is carcinogenic, and you should get excited about that. But it just doesn't have the same, I don't know, sort of attraction. It's not as emotive, is it? It's not poo. So it doesn't capture the public attention the same. The other problem is it only happens when it's raining. Yeah. And so people don't see highway runoff pollution because they're not out with the dog, they're not out for a wander up the riverbank. And so I think you've seen the photograph of that, how, you know, just throwing dirty black runoff into the river. Nobody sees it.
I mean, it might also be that, you know, in terms of our perception, when it comes to sewage, we imagine water companies using the opportunity of rising water levels to pump sewage, and so it feels like it's an active process, whereas when it comes to water runoff, it feels like a sort of effectively a passive process. It's something that happens accidentally, but isn't something that's being sort of deliberately created. So I think that might be a reason why we've had less success getting people to care about this.
You're probably right, but that use of the word pumped is completely unfounded. Water companies don't pump sewage effluent into rivers. It's a gravity. And it's interesting because the sewer overflows function by gravity, the highway runoffs functions by gravity too, but everybody's wound themselves up and said that water companies are actively pumping out sewage to save money. Actually, the storm sewer overflow problem evolved from a failure to regulate, because if the storm sewer overflow permits had been reviewed every 8 years by the Environment Agency, as they should have been, we would never have ended up where we are today. And the pollution from highway runoff is equally a failure to regulate. If the Environment Agency had got a grip of this 25 years ago, we wouldn't be here today.
Do you want to?
Given that we have to write a report with recommendations to government, is that a recommendation that we should be making, that there's greater enforcement by the new super environment agency that's going to emerge after of those periodic reviews of the permits?
Well, they don't have permits, so the first step would be for them to apply permits to a proportion of the highway outfalls.
They don't even have.
There's not a single permit for a highway discharge in England. I'm aware of one, but it's not a national highways one.
Was it seen as heavy-handed approach?
Yeah, well, and indeed, I've had a conversation recently with the Environment Agency, but I complained about an outfall, and they said we do not regulate highway outfalls, and we have no intention of changing our position on that. And so I complained to the OEP about them, and we'll see what happens with the OEP complaint, but they will not serve notice on these outfalls. They just won't do it.
I think I should say before we finish, you quite rightly corrected me there, Ms Bradley, with regard to the way that the sewage process happens, and I was trying to talk about how people perceived it, but I recognise we should be careful with what we say, so I thank you for that clarification. Joe Bradley, Catherine Moncrief, thank you very much indeed for the evidence that we've heard today. I'm sure the Highways Agency have been listening with great interest, and we look forward to hearing their response to yours and to the first panel. But thank you very much. We'll bring this second panel to a close. Sitting suspended. Order.
Very good.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, and also with I mean, do you think there's stuff coming out of this that we'd like to do with
it's just if you remind me
what? Oh, do you want, let me shuffle up here. Yeah. You move along, or I'll take this one. Like, lined up with my
No, but I am. I'm already.
No, I don't need to.
You guys already? Okay, well we will count down from 5 and start the broadcast going again, and then we'll begin. So 5, 4, 3, 2. Order. Well, welcome back to the third panel of today's event, looking at a brief study into national highways. And with this third panel, we're joined by Nick Harris, Chief Executive of National Highways, and Stephen Elderkin, the Director of Environmental Sustainability. Welcome, gentlemen. If I could start by just asking you, I think we'd probably broadly understand what the Chief Executive does, but maybe just to broadly explain your responsibilities within the organisation, and then we'll get into the first panel on the subject of the biodiversity net gain and tree planting, and then the second session will be on pollution, which we've just been listening to. So, Mr. Harris.
Perfect, thank you, Chair. So, Nick Harris, Chief Executive of National Highways. So, I'm responsible for the day-to-day operation of the business. I've been with National Highways, and Highways England as we were before, for 10 years now. And National Highways England was created through roads reform in 2015. So before 2015 with the Highways Agency, now National Highways.
Good afternoon, Steve Elderkin, Director of Environmental Sustainability at National Highways. My team are responsible for the 3 strategic outcomes in our environmental sustainability strategy, so making the transition to net zero highways, being positive for nature, and tackling local environmental pollution for the benefit of communities. I've also been with Highways for about 10 years. Prior to that, I had 10 years as a government economist, working mostly in environmental policy.
Excellent. So I think we will direct our questions to you, Mr. Harris. If you want to bring Mr. Elderkin in, that's for you to do as you see fit.
Thank you.
I want to, as I said, we're talking firstly about the issue of tree planting, and obviously the first part of our session that we heard today. I thank you both for being here to listen to the first 2 panels, because obviously that's very relevant. And I'd like to talk particularly firstly about issues of planting failure rates. We've seen reference to the A45, A6 Chans Mill Junction in Northamptonshire, and the A14 Cambridge to Huntingdon Road. Can you explain to us what went wrong and what you're doing to remedy it in these specific cases?
Perfect, thank you, Jeff. So I'll just put that in context, if I may, and then I'll hand over to Steve, who will talk about some of the lessons we've learned from the A14. So I think the first thing that I wanted to share with the committee is, I mean, we're a big landowner. So we operate the 4,500 miles that are the strategic road network, mainly the motorways and larger A roads, and all of the land that is alongside them. So we're a large landowner, so we care about the long-term sustainability of the environment around the roads that we look after. A very small percentage of that road network is new schemes, and it is important that we get those right, but they make up a small percentage of looking after the whole environment or land that we're responsible for. So we plant a lot of trees. I mean, we plant probably only second to the Forestry Commission in England in the number of trees we plant. We employ, mainly in Steve's team, experts in not just tree planting, but hedges and biodiversity, looking after grasslands. And we follow very keenly a lot of the development in knowledge around climate resilience, climate adaptation, so that we're choosing the right species. One of the big issues we're dealing with at the moment is ash dieback. So as the ash is dying, we remove them. What are we going to replace them with? So we're thinking about trees along the whole network. As you heard earlier, we have standards in place. We have a lot of detailed technical advice on how to go about tree planting and looking after trees. And we experience in general about the same kind of dieback rate on new planting, which is about 20%. Moving on to the A14, we saw a much worse performance than that. So of the 356,000 or so trees that we planted alongside the A14, we saw a dieback rate of about 45%. And there was reference earlier to what were called POPs, so there's a post-opening report. So we evaluate at different times how well the schemes that we've developed or delivered are doing. So we knew that it wasn't working well there. And of course we're talking about little saplings with very small root balls. So we were addressing that and replacing those trees. We've replaced something like 160,000, and we're seeing a dieback rate of under 15% now, so we're actually beating the kind of average. But perhaps more importantly, what did we learn from that, and what are we going to do moving forward? So I'll pass that over to Steve, if I may.
Yeah, so importantly, we do have examples of successful schemes, but we need to learn the lessons from the A14 scheme, where clearly the level of losses were unacceptably high. It was a particularly challenging summer for a first season for those trees, so it was the year that we had the 40-degree summer in 2022. It was an exposed site, soils were challenging for the planting. We may not have got all the decisions right on the choices of trees.
We're all in agreement that you didn't get all the decisions right, yeah.
Yeah, so the learnings, what we've applied to the replanting is looking at using plug-grown plants rather than bare root plants for those soil conditions more likely to be successful, to add mulch, and to make sure, as we've heard earlier, that the watering regime afterwards is in place to do that. So for all of our construction projects, there is a requirement that you must have 5 years of aftercare funded through the project, and will be.
Can you expand a bit about what actually went wrong? I mean, you've gone through very quickly there. You know, it was a tough summer, and exposed site. These feel like fairly sort of straightforward things that we would expect you to be, able to work around. I mean, can you? Yeah, the learnings also sound fairly basic in comparison to maybe what we're listening to in the first panel. I mean, just to expand upon what you think actually went wrong to see such a sort of catastrophic and high-profile failure.
It was a combination of the soil conditions, the weather conditions that summer, and then the lack of full aftercare that was applied to those whips.
Yeah, so I mean, if that we've had another hot summer now, if that hot summer had taken place now with the benefit of what you've learned since 2022, how would you think it would have been different?
So we undertook the replanting of the 160,000 or so trees in the winter of 23-24, and our indications are that those trees are surviving, and that's because we've applied the lessons learned to the replanting.
Yeah. So what have you done differently?
Well, We've required that oversight and aftercare. My team are now monitoring the delivery of environmental mitigations more immediately than through the post-opening project evaluation process. So before projects are finished, we will go out and audit and check the environmental mitigations that have been delivered.
And I think perhaps just to add to that, what we've been successful at doing, and this has been an ongoing development since our creation in 2015, is how we better integrate the knowledge and capability that exists in national highways to everything we do. So building schemes was a bit separate. Now we're using the skills that sit in Steve's team, but also in our regional environmental and operational teams. The folk who are looking after the verges and trees that we have that are not associated with schemes day in, day out, making sure we've got the right standards in place for contractors and holding them to account.
And you said earlier that new builds are a very small proportion of what you do, but in the context of biodiversity, and again, obviously this is a new area for you because your major responsibility existing road network. You then have occasional major new developments, but with these occasional new developments, you now have specific sort of legal responsibilities that weren't there previously. Do you think you were properly sort of prepared for this new responsibility? And whereas previously you may well have thought, well, it'd be nice to have some trees, now you actually have to do this. Do you think that lessons have been learned in terms of the preparation for the sort of BNG world that we now operate, that each new scheme is going to have far greater legal requirements on you? And do you feel that as a sort of government body you're properly equipped to deliver in those cases?
So I'll share 2 or 3 observations on that, and then I'll talk a bit about our environmental sustainability strategy. I'll ask Steve to do that. In general, yes. So we're funded in 5-year cycles. So the last 5-year cycle actually ended not in March just gone, but a year we're in an interim kind of year before the next 5-year cycle starts in April 26. Within that 5-year funding is a clear definition of our targets, what we have to deliver, and that includes obviously they need to comply with legislation, but also environmental targets. That was clear in the last road period, last 5-year period, and we were funded to do that. And the overall objective for the last road period was no net loss in biodiversity, which we achieved. In fact, we had a small gain in biodiversity, which is composed of looking after our existing green areas as well as what we were doing with projects. I just wanted to just share a few thoughts on biodiversity, and perhaps it's worth talking about an example, which is a project we're still on site with, which is Junction 10 on the M25. So that's where the A3 meets the M25 near Wisley. So those of you might know the Royal Horticultural Society at Wisley. That's the location.
I'm going to stop you for a minute because I'm not sure you've actually answered the question I had asked before you go on to this new and interesting development. I mean, do you think that you were equipped? So you talked about the funding cycle. I assume that in referring to, like you're saying, well, actually in 2020 BNG didn't exist. We had a different set of demands on us. Do you feel you were properly equipped to deliver on BNG?
So in 2020, no net loss biodiversity it did exist.
It did exist.
Yes. And was a different requirement.
And was a target. There's a different requirement coming, and I'll come on to that if I may, Chair. So what I was going to do by using the example was explain biodiversity is about much more than trees. So at Junction 10, where we're increasing the size of the roundabout above the M25, we're looking at the landscape much more widely. So that is looking at the appropriate tree species, and that means removing a lot of trees that are no longer the right choices we heard earlier, but also looking at grassland and hedges and bushes and how watercourses work which increases biodiversity. So most biodiversity doesn't come from trees. So that you have to look at the whole thing. Why does that matter? Well, roads sit within the environment, and as we heard earlier, the challenges we have, and we're going to come on to water quality and drainage, the much more sustainable way of doing this is by working with nature and looking for nature-based solutions. So for us, it's not just a matter of biodiversity and net gain in biodiversity. It's about working with nature to sustainably solve the challenges we have in operating a road network. As we look to the next 5-year period, we will need on schemes to achieve a 10% increase in biodiversity. And that's a challenge that we are organised and ready to do. That's for new schemes that start in the next 5 years. If I pass over to Stephen, you can just talk about our environmental sustainability strategy.
Just to build on the biodiversity point, we were asked in 2020 to take on this no net loss of biodiversity target, and we were an early adopter essentially of this metric. And I think a couple of learnings we've got from that would be worth sharing. One is we set targets for all of our major projects on their performance for biodiversity. This wasn't a legal requirement, but it was a way of incentivising thought and care about biodiversity in the design of schemes. And what we found is through the 5-year period, we lost about 2,000 fewer biodiversity units through our construction programme than we anticipated. And that's because they were designed from an early stage to consider nature, they were delivered more sensitively, and they took the opportunities within the development boundary. Second is we've delivered an awful lot of biodiversity units through partnerships with environmental organisations. So we've delivered with National Trust, with wildlife trusts, with RSPB, with Plant Life, and the vast majority of the biodiversity units we delivered through the 5 years were delivered by those bodies. And so it's the way that we will achieve the 10% requirement on our projects is partly to design and deliver well, but it will also be to be strengthening and deepening those partnerships with the environmental sector.
And then just to ask you one final time, Mr. Harris, do you feel that with the current requirement for the 10% gain, the budgets that you had from 20 to 2025, the interim period now, are you currently properly equipped to deliver on what is required of you?
Yes, so for the projects that will start in the next 5 years, yes, we are. We have the skills and capability to do it, the partnerships, as Steve mentioned, and we're funded to do it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Pippa Haley.
Thank you. So at its outset, and this A14 improvement scheme is declared as award-winning, and proudly at the outset said it was an early adopter, setting out 11.5% biodiversity net gain, tree planting, so differences, and noise and air pollution approach, which enabled it to get through the DCO, the Development Consent Order. And this was in Cambridgeshire, where my constituency lies, which has an aspirational target of 20% biodiversity net gain, and therefore this was key for the approval process with the DCO. As you have said yourself, what we have seen is 860,000, I beg to differ, around 860,000 trees potentially planted in the wrong soil at the wrong time of the year, with no consideration for climate change or the fact that Cambridgeshire is a water-stressed area, no maintenance follow-up. And what we have now, as my constituents and local councillors see, is a desert festooned with the plastic tree containers. And this matters, and we want to learn the lessons from this, because this matters, because it risks undermining trust in biodiversity net gain, and the DCO and all of the ways in which we enable large infrastructure projects to come through. And as the Chair said, there are new requirements for this. At the time, you claimed you were equipped. So that is why we're going to be really, I want to now dig down into some of the issues. So firstly, can you say what surveys did take place at the beginning about the species, about the soil conditions, and about the planting times? Can you just explain to us what
So as part of the DCO, the original design and DCO submission, is that what you're referring to?
No, I think after the DCO, when you then did the design of the actual...
Well, the design would have been done for the DCO. So I'll kind of see in the lessons learned. What did we find from that?
So just to... Absolutely, the 350,000 trees were the ones by the side of the carriageway. There are further trees planted around the borough pits, and there will need to be more replanting to come. Just to say, we will absolutely stay the course, and I know that at the moment it's not looking good, but we will see it through and get the landscape around the road looking as it should. I can't give you the precise details of the survey process. So the way that we work up to a development consent order is we work with our supply chain, who bring in qualified landscape architects and expertise to provide the documents that are submitted to the planning process.
Mm-hmm. So I do know that because there were serious local concerns following the DCO, and at the time when the planting was being considered, there was a group which was between Highways England at the time, National Highways, and the local authorities and the experts that came, local councils and local community. And there was expertise brought in to consider concerns around those species and the soil type and the time, and yet still it went ahead regardless. Why do you think, having brought in and spent money on bringing in the expertise, that was not then applied?
I think what I can talk about is how we do things now.
I'd like
I'm interested in
I mean,
what happened then.
So we can talk about how the process of design and DCO is done. I mean, we can provide more information to the committee, but we don't have to hand that detail with us.
So I find it quite shocking, actually. You've come to this committee knowing that this particular example would be would be one of the issues that has the greatest lessons to be learned. And Chair, if you allow me, I also know that at the County Council, the Cambridgeshire County Council, the Transport Committee asked these same commissions, no information was forthcoming. So, public scrutiny and accountability is key, isn't it? Wouldn't you think that coming to this committee, you would have prepared some of those answers?
So I think we perhaps we can go over the answers again. So in the design, we employed landscape architects to produce the designs. A whole range of surveys were done: environmental surveys, soil surveys. Advice will have been taken on species selection, and all of that went into the DCO application, which then went to public consultation, and there were a whole host of questions on that and many other things. Ultimately, there was a decision process around the DCO, and then that's the scheme that we've then implemented. As we talked about earlier, we found that the approach that was used to establish the planting failed, which is not good, and which is why we're addressing that. And we looked at why it failed, so in terms of the particular climatic conditions, the type of species and rootstock that was being used, the preparation of the soil, and we've learned from that, which is why with the planting we've now done there, we're seeing normal survival rates. And our focus as an organisation isn't just building a scheme and then moving on. Our focus is establishing the planting scheme for this project and looking after it in well into the future, because it forms a really important part of the biodiversity we're creating around alongside our network. And one of the other lessons I think we have definitely learned through it is the need to have the right supervision and control on both the contractors when they're doing the work, but in the follow-up. and that's what we're applying.
So we heard from the previous panel how important monitoring is, and you've just mentioned that, and data. Wouldn't you think, therefore, there is a role within the local authorities that through the DCO then have the role to be actually monitoring, that information should be available to the local authorities for scrutiny to bring back that trust and to be able to know what is happening? Would you agree that should be available?
So, I mean, we have an obligation to meet the requirements of the DCO, an obligation which we take incredibly seriously. Overall, we are monitored by the Office for Rail and Road, and they look at our compliance with DCOs amongst a whole host of things. I think that's why one of the reasons why we're very keen to build partnerships with local organisations and environmental organisations, because we recognise we're not the experts in this, although we do employ a number of experts. And we look to work with them to adopt best practice. And we're more than happy to be transparent and share information.
You are.
So the post-project appraisal process is about sharing that data, and if there is interest in adding to the data that we share, I'm sure we're happy to do that.
So at a future meeting, you would be prepared to provide that information, given that you've given the commitment today that there will be...
we're more than happy if there is an interest locally and they don't feel there's been the connection. We would be more than happy to meet with them and go through what we've done there in detail.
And you do understand that, as the way I'm hearing, you understand that because of this, it's hard for many to have that trust, both in biodiversity net gain and tree planting of large infrastructure, but also that you do have a commitment not just to the engineering and building of the infrastructure, but also that land and the tree.
We're very clear, and we go much beyond that. I mean, we have a very clear objective, not only to connect the country from a transport point of view, but to connect it from an environmental point of view. So that's absolutely in our mission, and we're very successful with it in other locations. It's not gone right here, and we'd be happy to come to Cambridge and talk about it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think we'd be grateful for more transparency. I think on the surveys, I would ask you to write back to us after this session to let us know about what surveys took place. And I think, I understand you're keen to sort of move to what we're doing now, but I mean, in terms of this inquiry, we are, keen to know what actually happened then too. So I'm going to bring in Barry Gardner at this stage.
Thank you, Chair. I didn't feel that we got real clarity from what you said. Because you explained that as part of the DCO you had employed consultants, they prepared the scheme and established the criteria for the planting, and then you said why it had gone wrong, but what you didn't say was it that the experts that you got involved got it wrong? They didn't understand what the soil quality was or what the nature of the trees that they ought to have been planting there was. So they gave you the wrong data, information to establish the DCO. Or was it that your contractors did not actually comply with what your experts had said? So if we're trying to locate where the damage resulted from, was it the experts, in which case, what have you done to sue them? Or was it the contractors, in which case, what have you done to sue them?
So, just to step back a little from that, so we have a set of standards. It's called the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, and that covers the way in which we maintain and renew and improve the strategic road network. When we go to contract with a project like the A14, there's a very detailed specification that will have come from the consultants and will then manage the contract. Turning to the lessons we learned from what went wrong with the A14.
I asked very specific questions, and with respect, you are not giving me very specific answers.
And so, if we turn to looking at what went wrong, most of the issues lie with the execution, so the construction, not the design. So we understood the soil, the appropriate species were selected, but it wasn't executed, which is why the replanting we're doing is a contractual conversation with the contractors, because they haven't met the quality obligations.
Thank you. That is clear. Who were the contractors?
So it was a consortium. The overall contractors for this was a consortium of Costains, Balfour, BT, and Skanska. But they will have subcontracted the planting to another organisation.
And was the element that you found to be wanting in the original specification, was that about the time of year of planting?
So one of the big issues, as Steve mentioned, was the time of year of planting and an unusually hot and dry period.
Indeed, that's why I'm asking the question. So had they put into the brief, the experts, had they said it would be best to try and do this planting in the autumn or in the spring rather than in the heat of the summer?
So yes,
So our specifications set out that planting should take place between November and March.
But it didn't.
We'll have to come back to you on that. I'm not aware of it being outside that window.
So we'll confirm, was it done in the correct window? But I think from the follow-up, it was more an issue of the aftercare, not the...
I think it was, Chair, if you'd allow, I think our concern is, you said deep lessons have been learned, and yet we're not hearing them. You know, I think that's the key thing here. You know, Chair, it's worrying actually, because we're ready to hear that there is improvement.
I mean, I return to what I said before. I mean, there have been not only from this, there have been lessons learnt from more widely, and the biggest one has been integrating how the organisation delivers work like this, so that we are using the expertise we have effectively to make sure that when we're doing projects, they are supervised well, our specifications and quality is met. And I mean, I sit in every 2 months we have a meeting that looks not only at safety but also quality, and we look specifically at quality instances, which is not just about asphalt and steel and the normal things that you might imagine looking after roads, but also how we're doing on our environmental work. So the lessons have been, but we'd be more than happy to write to the committee on what we have done to change the way we approach things.
And perhaps we could be positive, whether or not, following on from Mr. Gardner's questions, whether sometimes the delivery programme and the need to get it done for value for money reasons that were quoted could challenge or be in contradiction with the expertise and advice given about the planting season. I don't want you to answer that now, but when you go back, please consider whether that is also, because that I think is an important thing for future, if there are these kind of challenges, contradictions.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps very briefly, I mean, I would say no. I mean, meeting the DCO obligation has to be achieved. So we care about the long-term achievements, so the planting is there successful and continues to be successful long into the future. So there isn't a conflict in terms of money or progress in the project.
Yeah. You were here for the first panel that we had, and you heard from the gentleman from Kew Gardens about the sort of lack of skills and expertise within horticulture, and something that's a global issue, and he spoke incredibly knowledgeably about many of the issues that face us. I mean, listening to what you're saying, do you have the same confidence about the experts that you're listening to and that you were advising on this project? Because I have to say, the sort of things we're hearing from you do seem to be pretty basic stuff. You know, it doesn't sound like someone who's who spent years and years at university should have been incapable of being able to deliver. So are you confident that the quality of expertise that you have that's supporting you, whether through subcontractors, partners, or people who you employ, is of the sufficient quality, or was of the sufficient quality in this programme?
So we select our consultants and partners rigorously based on capability and quality. But more than that, we work with partners to improve our understanding. In fact, Q is one of the partners that we work with on this, so we do rely on their advice. But I mean, Steve, you're working on this.
Yeah, and so we made a commitment to plant 3 million trees beyond our sort of essential mitigations for major projects, and we partnered with the Tree Council to provide that sort of assurance of our approach. And we've been working with them to choose the seed stock and the species that we're growing, and we've been looking to use that to develop the capacity within the British nursery sector to grow trees. So we are trying to use our commitments and funding in this space to improve the capacity.
Well, it's great to hear we have these experts working on it. You would think things like what time of year they plant trees and which species they use might be part of this expertise they built up, wouldn't you?
Well, we're very clear about the time of year that trees should be planted, and that's based upon expert advice, and I believe it's sound advice.
Thank you. Alison Taylor.
Just a few brief comments, Chair. My background's in surveying, and I just wondered if I just could ask a few questions around, was it all external consultants that, or was an element of the project management dealt with internally by your own team? And it's really good that you're learning lessons from it, and that's really important. And I just wondered, going forward, if there was plans to change the way you procure these sort of projects. Do you think it was possible a way the procurement brief was written, that there was maybe, I'm trying to work out if there was any gaps that have been identified in the whole project.
So with the A14, we're talking about a procurement that took place in about 2014, I think it was. So we've changed the way we procure at least twice since then. And we've built up within National Highways a much stronger level of knowledge ourselves. So Steve's team is now advising on contract specification, development, and how we select and hire for projects. So those are big changes we've made over the last 10 or 12 years. We're spending a lot of time talking about decisions that were made 15 years ago, and we've made a lot of improvements since then, and we continue to improve.
Okay, that's good to hear. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, John Whitby.
Thank you, Chair. The DCO states clearly that any tree or shrub that dies within that 5-year period needs to be replaced. And you've already said you've replanted 160,000. So I've done the maths, and that seems like 45% of 336,000 trees. So you've obviously replanted once. Obviously, we're still in that 5-year window, and what we've heard today is you normally lose about 20%. So are you monitoring this often enough to know that there's probably another 32,000 trees that you need to replant?
Yes, we are.
Yes, and that will happen.
If you use Pippa's figure, okay. I'm going with your figure.
So for the trees by the carriageway, it's 160,000 was the replacing the ones that had been lost. The ones that have failed from that replanting will be replanted this winter. There will also be extensive replanting around the boropits and the remediation scheme in that area, and that will be a very significant number of trees that still need to be planted this winter.
So what's your understanding of your responsibility once you've replanted, let's say, I don't know, a year or two after the original construction? Are you then responsible, do you think, for another 5 years to maintain that tree? We've already heard today that they need, between 5 and 7 years to really establish themselves and have some confidence they're going to survive. So are you going to be around for another 5 years, and maybe the second lot of replanting another 5 years after that, or do you just get 5 years?
So, like all of the network, the road network, we're responsible for. We remain responsible for the wildlife, the trees, in perpetuity, forever. Can't say it. Perpetuity, thank you. Some of the boropits we are looking to make other arrangements with, so find others who will want to take those on. There are some opportunities to create some habitat connection and actually improve biodiversity further there. So we're looking at those, and of course the responsibility for looking after them ultimately will pass on.
And just final thing for me. So how can planning officers and ministers who are in case of major projects have any confidence that mitigation and BNG commitments in planning applications will be fulfilled?
So we have to report annually on what we're achieving with biodiversity. More than that, we have our sustainable environmental strategy, and that is requiring us to be transparent about what we're achieving and to report periodically to ministers on that. So we're very proud of what we're achieving and what we're setting out to achieve, and I'm very keen to share that.
We'll make that dream come true. Yeah. Okay,
well,
so
we're willing to come back another.
Olivia Blake now, just to finish off on this and then to move us on to the issue of road pollution.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to pick up on what all this has cost in terms of the A14, and in particular what costs have so far been spent on putting this issue right, and what the estimated costs will be going forward of putting it right, if that makes sense.
So over the planting, that's a commercial conversation with the contractors. They've not met the quality standards, so that planting isn't.
So it's falling
that falls on them, not the public purse.
And
so just to clarify, that falls on them, not the public purse.
And is that true for all the trees that you haven't?
Well, it depends on how they've been established. Okay. So, I mean, for example, I mentioned earlier the issue of ash dieback. That's a cost that falls on us, because that's our estate to manage.
So you're doing good contract management, in your opinion?
So we are doing good contract management, and we're always seeking to improve how we manage our contractors. It's our responsibility.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Chair. I think that's useful to clarify. Moving on then to kind of pollution, which is the other issue we've kind of been highlighting today. Our predecessor committee's recommendations on water quality in rivers focused on accelerating improvements to highway drainage, and the government accepted that a level of increased ambition and delivery in this area should be supported. Can you outline this programme, how this programme has developed since 2022's report? How many assets have been assessed since the report was published? How many high-risk sites now have mitigations in place?
Perfect. Yeah. So since I was in front of the committee in 2021, and I mean certainly the recommendations of the committee have helped accelerate the process significantly. So that's definitely worth noting. We have been working hard on, if I go back to the committee, I mentioned there was 1,236 locations where we believe there was a high risk of pollution. Going back to some of the earlier conversations, we, under the Highways Act, and I should perhaps first of all describe how the kind of system works. So we have the 4,500 miles of strategic road network. And we're only talking about those, not all the other roads, which have the same challenge. And we need to drain the water the rainfall that is falling on the land adjacent to the roads and on the roads, so that they are safe to drive on. So there's a series of drains pipes that collect all of that, and then there are points where that's either discharged into soakaway, so it goes into the ground and is soaked away, or into watercourses, streams, sometimes via settlement ponds, sometimes directly. So we identified these 1,236 locations that we needed to understand what was there, and do we need to put in place mitigations, build something that would manage the pollution that could be coming from those locations. Probably also worth saying at the same time, we've been working very closely for the last 12 years or so with the Environment Agency on what we do to mitigate against pollution at outfall. So I mentioned the design manual for roads and bridges before. We have detailed design specifications for what we put in place and how much silt sediment it can remove and what pollutants it can remove. So there are design standards which have been peer reviewed. They're not just our view. So we've assessed all of them, and we've now been developing a program. And when I was here in 2021, I think I said that we expected about 10% of those 1,236 would need work doing on. Others would find already had mitigations in or didn't exist, or there were other reasons why they didn't need addressing. We found so far we've got 180 locations where we're going to be developing designs. We've already got about 100 in development. We expect that to grow to about 250. Why? Because since I was here and since we've been doing that work, we've been working with other organisations to gain information from them about locations we may not have had knowledge of. And we expect, therefore, to be delivering a programme of about 250 that we need to do by 2030. But we don't rest there. We're continuing to. I mean, as we've heard earlier, this is a serious issue, and we should care very much about pollution that's going into the environment, and we do as an organisation. So this is a matter, I think, of how we prioritise how we do that. So we're identifying, hopefully, the very worst locations that we can actually get stuck into and do something about.
So that's the identification.
But it shouldn't be the end of it.
How many of those high-risk sites now have mitigations active in
So
place?
since I was here, we've done, I think, 40, and we're now expecting to do another 250.
Okay, that's useful. Are you confident that the methodology has identified all the high-risk sites? I think the numbers you kind of cited sound quite different from what we've heard from other witnesses.
I mean, we're talking about, so since about 2010, everything we've built since then, we understand, and we've had design standards in place to deal with. We have a huge legacy of network that goes back decades, so it would be presumptuous of me to say, do we understand everyone? That's why we're very open to anyone sharing with us any information that we can act on.
Are you supporting any kind of citizen science for flagging any issues? I know the water companies do support that, although I'm sure we'll discuss how successful that's been.
And I'll hand over to Steve. I mean, the other thing we've been doing is, chalk streams, rivers was mentioned earlier, which we're also looking at working. We've been working together with Southern Water in the case of Hampshire, and we are in the process of finalising new standards for discharges around structure, but Steve, particularly on the point of citizen intervention.
So the 1,236 locations we prioritised to reassess based on some characteristics that made us worry that they could carry a high risk of pollution. We're absolutely not confident that that is going to all the high risk outlets outfalls are going to be in that set. And so we've been holding a number of round table sessions involving CIWEM, Natural England, Environment Agency, and looking at the particular receiving water bodies that we should put more attention on, and we are going to reassess the risk at a number of other sites, and that's where we expect the number to grow from the 180 that we've confirmed today to a larger number by the time we've gone through that process. And then in terms of citizen science, we're absolutely aware that we don't have perfect data on our drainage asset. We are open to information that is provided to us. So we were given information about the M6 at Chorley, and then we're able to implement a renewal scheme for an area that had fallen into disrepair in that place. Similarly, the River Lambourne information that we received about that, we were able to renew the treatment works that were in place.
So obviously monitoring is one gap that we're kind of aware of, but the other recommendation that our predecessor's report kind of focused on was giving a greater amount of the budget to mitigating pollution. You've only received an interim settlement and the third road investment strategy is now due next year. What certainty do you have that you'll be able to meet the target on mitigation, to mitigate all high-risk outfalls by 2030?
So we're proceeding on the basis that we will be funded to do all 250. So the interim year hasn't affected our planning design work. We're moving forward with the assumption that it's all going to be funded. RIS 3 is not yet finalised, so you may have seen that the draft funding was published last week, and we're now going through a process which means that the Office for Rail and Road is evaluating what's in it and the deliverability and the efficiency targets we need to hit, and then there will be our response will be a draft strategic business plan which will include this programme, and assuming all of that is signed off and agreed by ministers, we will continue delivering.
And just briefly on risk, you're obviously focusing on high risk, completely understand that. Is because we don't know enough about the harms, as our witnesses highlighted, do you think that there is potential for more resources needed to kind of go down to what you would consider medium risk, and how are you evaluating medium risk as well?
So we are using a risk assessment tool that was developed after a 12-year joint monitoring programme that we ran with the Environment Agency. So we think that's the most extensive monitoring evidence that underpins the management of highways runoff anywhere in Europe. And so that, and so we ran that for 12 years, and that provided the data that allowed us to understand the relationships between traffic volumes, surface area, and the risks that it presented to the receiving water bodies. We know that that isn't kind of the final word, so we're in the third phase of some further monitoring work around microplastics and to understand those. And we've also been looking at a suite of other chemicals, including PFAS, and looking for further evidence. What we found is that broadly the relationships that were found in that previous monitoring hold in terms of the scale of the pollution, and so we continue to use it for the moment to identify the highest risk outfalls that we're going to address first. Okay. That isn't the end. I think you can keep going on this agenda, but the commitment we've made is to address the high risk ones by 2030.
Given that so much of the UK is now at flood risk, do you see these risks, the patterns of these risks changing over time, and how are you going to stay fleet of foot on that?
Yeah.
So I'll start with the projects that we're building now and where we're renewing or replacing existing assets. Our current standards include for climate change, so we're addressing that. But of course that leaves a large legacy of roads that will be susceptible to climate change.
Yeah, so we updated the drainage capacity for our drains in our standards in 2006. Since then, only 7% of our drainage system has been constructed. So 93% of our drains predate the 20% capacity increase we put in place at that time. We will be publishing new capacity standards which will go between 20 and 35% depending on the catchment area to allow for those climate scenarios. But the challenge is retrofit, just as with the treatment works. How do you retrofit? And digging up and replacing 93% of our drains is unlikely to be affordable or the customer impact acceptable. So it's going to also be a question of working with nature here. So we've had a scheme running through the last 5 years where we've been helping to regenerate the moorland around Manchester. and a healthy blanket bog absorbs rainwater, acts like a sponge, holds it when it's raining, so attenuates the flow of water onto our network. It also holds the water in dry spells and reduces the risk of wildfire. And so we've run a feasibility study with Moors for the Future Partnership, and we're expecting an extensive set of works around the M62 and the A628 to regenerate the moorland, get the sphagnum moss in place. Good for nature, good for carbon, but also good for the economy because it will keep those two vital arteries open.
Finally, we've spoken about getting the mitigations in place, but once these are in place, do you feel that you have the resources to maintain these, given you're probably going to have to deal with more things to maintain, essentially?
Yes, I mean, it is a challenge. I mean, there's a continual squeeze on our operating costs. Most businesses face that, so we're not unusual in that. So we're constantly looking for ways of operating more efficiently, and actually that does bring us back to nature-based solutions.
But just specifically on maintaining the mitigations that you've got in.
So going there. So we're looking at where can we, rather than coming up with hard solutions that need active management, can we increasingly use things like reed beds and the retention lagoons are not so new, but reed beds and other solutions like that need far lower operating cost and add to the environment at the same time.
I think that's it, Chair.
Thank you very much. Pippa, you wanted to come in, or?
Just following on from what Olivia was asking, from the previous panel we had heard that this is really difficult in terms of the monitoring that you've been talking about, because the Environment Agency isn't actually doing that monitoring. So when you say that you've been doing this 12-year joint monitoring project, which is first of its kind, and yet it's not actually... Can you just help us understand that it seems like a direct contradiction between the two panels?
Yes, happy to clarify. So we ran a 12-year research programme jointly with the Environment Agency, and a big part of that was extensive monitoring around our network.
So not regulatory monitoring, but monitoring to provide data for the...
and that helped us understand the relationships between traffic volumes and pollution loads, and that is what underpins the model that we use for making risk assessments. I should say that we are...
Would you be supportive of the kind of recommendations that the committee was considering from the previous panel, that the Environment Agency should be doing more of that monitoring?
So I would say that, our focus is on mitigating, solving the pollution problem. That's where our resources are going. I mean, of course, we do need data to support that. But the wider question, and listen to the conversation earlier, we have to sort of, permitting isn't a magic solution. So if we know more, then we have to have the resources to do something about it. So I think it's more a question of, okay, we know the problem exists. How are we going to do that in a constructive way that prioritises the issue?
Is that a no to my question?
So it's not a question for us to answer. Definitely a question for DEFRA ministers and the Environment Agency.
Yeah, just picking up exactly the same points. But we heard from Ms. Bradley of the absolute toxicity of one of the outflows that she'd monitored. And we know that the Environment Agency says that it is not and doesn't foresee itself in a regulatory role monitoring these outflows. They're not funded for it, you're not funded for it, and therefore, what was the point of the 12-year study?
Well, we want to make sure that the large sums of money we are using to mitigate against pollution are being used effectively. So that that's one reason for all of that work. We're also conscious of new understanding of new contaminants and pollutants, whether that's microplastics or we talked about PFAS earlier. So we want to understand that so that we're raising the question and giving the...
So the results of that 12-year study you will be presenting to the Department of Transport and saying, look, we have a problem here. This is what we're producing, the sort of stuff that Ms. Bradley told the committee about earlier, and we need to mitigate it, because otherwise we are polluting the environment. Is that the plan? Is that, I mean, otherwise what is the point of that 12-year study?
So the 12-year study allowed us to be able to produce a risk assessment tool that allowed us to make prioritisation decisions. It underpinned the rewriting of our standards in 2010, and the which treatment works we felt were appropriate for given locations. And we are continuing now to develop our understanding of other pollutants, microplastics and other chemicals, and that will feed in, and we intend to review the risk assessment tool within the next 24 months and work with partners such as...
What you've identified is a problem, and it therefore is incumbent on you to say, hold your hands up in effect and say, we've got a problem, and we're now coming to government and saying, help us solve that problem. So, now, as you said, that may well involve finance.
Yeah. So the process of setting the 5-year funding period starts with us issuing what's called the initial report, which sets out the things we think should be addressed. And so that's where that kind of ask goes. So in that initial report, when our water quality plan, which will, if everything pans out, end up in the next road period, we will then be doing another initial report for the subsequent 5-year funding period, and we would like to do more to address this issue.
And surely it would make sense for the Environment Agency or its successor body to be doing some regulatory monitoring to ensure that you are then meeting those standards that you've set and had accounted for in your plan going forward.
So we're running a series of roundtables which includes the Environment Agency, and we've developed a set of standardised design solutions that we will be looking for stakeholder feedback at an event on the 29th of September. And the Environment Agency are part of the process of identifying where we need to act and where we need to intervene.
Yes, but that
and then the
not regulatory monitoring.
So the interventions are very largely passive. So if we have made the risk assessment and this is the treatment facility that needs to be in place, then if we have put it in place, then that goes a long way to addressing the risk.
Yeah, they're not like a complex sewage treatment works that has a need for monitoring. If the solution was the right design and it's working, then it's mitigated. The other thing
in that case, it'll be very easy and very cheap for the Environment Agency to inspect them in a regulatory capacity and say, what a fine job you're doing.
That's a good challenge for them, I guess. But what more seriously, what I was going to add was, you talked about the Cunliffe report earlier. So looking at this at a catchment level, we think is a good approach. And we absolutely understand we would have to work in partnership as part of that catchment to address the health and quality of rivers and watercourses in the catchment. So I think there's a good question.
So would you support this committee making a recommendation that there should be regulatory monitoring of your outflows?
So I guess the way we're looking at it is that we are understanding how we mitigate. We're confident that can mitigate, and therefore our focus is to make sure it's working. How it's regulated is a question for others, I would say.
Well, no, I'm talking about the recommendations this committee should make. Sure. Because you want to get it right. That's what you're assuring us of. You want to get it right, and you're taking steps now to do that. And if you're confident in what you're doing, it should be perfectly natural that you say, let's be transparent, let's have a regulatory monitoring of what we do so that the public can be assured that they can trust us.
So we're more than happy to be held to account and to demonstrate what we're doing. I mean, the question of how, you will have to think about your recommendation and what's the best use of public money to achieve the outcome we're all looking for, I guess.
Okay, thank you. Alison Taylor.
Okay, well, thank you very much for all your answers. And this is actually the last question. So the previous government rejected the previous committee's call for the Environment Agency to require discharge permits for outfalls onto roads with heavy traffic, but they said it should be kept under review. We know that there are wider changes to regulation in the water sector, and have you had any discussions with DEFRA that might affect your approach to the national highways and the regulation of pollution going forward?
Nothing in the space of regulatory change or change to the regulatory bodies.
Okay, and just to sort of sum up, are there any measures that you think the government should be looking at to reduce road pollution at source rather than just mitigating against it?
I mean, as we heard earlier, I mean, dealing with these issues at source is always the most effective way to deal with them, to go forward. So I think adopting the European standards around particulates would be a positive move. We would definitely support that.
We've run a research program looking at the variability in the wear rates for tyres, and we find it's highly variable. And so, just as with energy using products, you've choice edited out the most energy inefficient, there is I think a strong argument for a similar approach with tyres.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harris, you said something that I think was very revealing earlier, which was that effectively, if we improve the monitoring, then it will create a demand, it will give us more knowledge, it will then create a demand for us to do something about it, it will create a demand for you to do something about it, and there's obviously cost implications to that. I mean, Joe Bradley in the previous panel was reflecting that there isn't anything like the public interest in the issue of monitoring the interest of road pollution in comparison to water pollution. But actually, if we knew what we were talking about, then there might be exactly that interest. So isn't it the case that actually, in terms of both the government's perspective and your own budgets, that it suits you very well for us not to know too much about what the level of pollution is and where exactly it's going? Because if we did know, there would be this demand for more to be done about it, wouldn't there?
So I disagree with that. I mean, I offer two observations. So, I mean, we are more than happy to respond to government's ask on pollution. So we're happy to do whatever is necessary. So we're not trying. There's nothing that we're trying to avoid here. We're working very hard to make sure we understand, in detail, the issues so that we respond with the right kind of priority and we're effective in what we do. As I said earlier, I think looking at this as a catchment rather than looking at each polluter or potential polluter separately is a very effective way forward, and we support that.
And I mean, you would be saying, what would you be saying to government if they said, well, look, we're going to make this a real priority, we want you to spend a great deal more of your resources on reducing road pollution runoff? What would be the trade-offs they'd have to consider in terms of what wouldn't you then be spending money on?
So we if we looked at things at a catchment level and understood what were the most significant polluters for a particular watercourse, then we could be addressing it in proportion. So effective use of everyone's money would definitely be a way forward. And certainly we've been working to bring together organisations to jointly work on nature-based solutions that can help this. Speaking just about ourselves, the way we prioritise is, of course, our first priority has to be the safety of everyone using roads. That we can't compromise on. After that, we're up for discussion.
But it might be that if you're spending more money on this, we'll have less money to build new roads, we'll have less money to maintain them, whatever else it might be. There would be trade-offs for government.
Well, beyond the question of safety, then everything becomes a matter of trade-offs, perhaps. Yeah.
Well, Mr. Harris, Mr. Elderkin, thank you very much indeed for coming on to today's session. And we're grateful. We look forward to hearing from you on those matters that were raised, and if the committee staff will communicate with you just to make sure we know, what it is that we still feel that we need to get from you in terms of further information. But bring this setting to a close. Order.